India's path toward economic independence marked a critical milestone in its journey to reclaim power from the West. For decades after independence, India's economy operated within a framework influenced by Western institutions, ideologies, and trade dependencies. Whether through foreign aid, Western-dominated global finance bodies, or reliance on imports for essential goods and technologies, India found itself entangled in systems where it had little control. But in recent years, a deliberate and determined transformation began to unfold. India no longer wished to be the world's market. It aimed to be a global manufacturer, innovator, and economic power rooted in its own strength. This shift was symbolized by a bold initiative, Attenborough Bharat, or self-reliant India. This vision wasn't about isolation or protectionism. It was about building internal strength so India could engage with the world on equal footing, not from a position of dependency. One of the first key areas of focus was manufacturing. For decades, India had struggled to become a global manufacturing hub due to red tape, lack of infrastructure, and foreign competition. However, through schemes like production-linked incentives PLI, Make in India, and significant investment in industrial corridors and logistics, India began encouraging both domestic and foreign companies to manufacture within its borders. Sectors like electronics, textiles, automotive, pharmaceuticals, and renewable energy saw a surge in domestic production capacity. This reduced the country's reliance on Chinese imports and Western supply chains that often dictated prices and availability. One of the most transformative changes came in the area of digital infrastructure. India moved beyond being a consumer of Western tech platforms and started building its own digital backbone. The development and global rollout of the Unified Payments Interface, UPI, positioned India as a leader in real-time digital payments. Unlike Western financial systems that were profit-driven and often exclusionary, UPI was publicly owned, universally accessible, and almost free for users. It revolutionized the Indian economy, brought millions into the formal banking system, and showcased a model that was not only efficient, but also egalitarian. Several countries began exploring partnerships to implement UPI-like systems, marking a rare moment where the West looked to India for technological inspiration. In addition to digital innovation, India focused heavily on localizing production in critical sectors. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the dangers of depending on foreign sources for essential items like medicines, ventilators, and vaccines. India responded with remarkable speed and scale. It ramped up domestic production of PPE kits, diagnostics, and eventually emerged as one of the world's top vaccine producers, not just meeting internal demand, but exporting to over 70 countries. This demonstrated that India had the capacity to not only meet global standards but exceed them, undermining the long-standing narrative that only Western countries could lead in science and medicine. India also restructured its trade policies, to serve national interest. It withdrew from unfavorable multilateral agreements like RCEP, which could have flooded Indian markets with cheap imports, and instead focused on bilateral trade deals that protected local industries while encouraging fair trade. This strategic recalibration wasn't just economic, it was geopolitical. It signaled that India would no longer sign deals out of fear of isolation or pressure from economic giants. It would trade on its terms, ensuring that Indian jobs, innovation, and industries were protected. Another defining feature of India's economic resurgence was the rise of Indian multinational companies. Indian firms like Reliance, Infosys, Tata, Adani, and Mahindra began expanding not only within India, but also into global markets. These companies started acquiring foreign firms, setting up global supply chains, and becoming part of the international value system as producers, not just consumers. Unlike earlier decades where foreign capital and companies dominated Indian industries, the tide began to turn. Indian capital was now shaping global business. The startup ecosystem became another force multiplier. India emerged as one of the world's top startup ecosystems, with thousands of new ventures being launched across sectors like fintech, health tech, edtech, agritech, and clean energy. Government-backed programs like Startup India and digital skilling initiatives empowered a new generation of entrepreneurs who were building for India and for the world. What was once a brain drain to the West began to reverse. Talented professionals who would have earlier sought careers in Silicon Valley started launching homegrown innovations in Bengaluru, Hyderabad, and Pune. This economic independence also translated into fiscal and monetary policies. The Reserve Bank of India adopted strategies that balanced inflation control with growth, without blindly mirroring Western central banks. When the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, India resisted overreaction. It maintained its policy independence and showed that its economy was robust enough to weather external financial storms. India's foreign exchange reserves crossed $600 billion at one point, giving it the strength to manage currency fluctuations and global economic shocks without running to the IMF or World Bank for help. India's push toward renewable energy also became a pillar of its economic transformation. It invested heavily in solar, wind, and green hydrogen, aiming not only to reduce carbon emissions, but also to reduce dependence on oil imports. Massive solar parks, domestic solar panel manufacturing, and global partnerships helped India become one of the largest producers of renewable energy. This green revolution had an economic impact. It created jobs, brought in investment, and strengthened India's energy security, lessening the grip of oil, exporting Western powers. Perhaps the most profound change has been psychological. For decades, economic success was measured by Western standards getting foreign investment, building Western-style infrastructure, attracting foreign brands. But the new India is proud of building its own brands, its own platforms, and its own path to prosperity. This self confidence is visible in every sector, from agriculture to aerospace. It is no longer about proving worth to the West, it is about serving the 4 billion people at home and creating a model that others might follow. India's economic independence is not yet complete, but it has crossed a point of no return. It is now a confident, ambitious, and self-driven economy. The day India took back economic power was not marked by any single event. It was a quiet revolution of choices, policies, and belief in national capability. It was the beginning of an unstoppable rise, powered not by aid or approval, but by determination and vision. India's technological and strategic advancement has been one of the most defining features of its transformation into a global power, no longer beholden to the West. For much of its post-independence history, India remained a consumer of advanced technology rather than a producer. It depended heavily on Western nations for defense systems, space research collaboration, telecommunications equipment, and digital innovation. But this dynamic began to shift dramatically in the last decade, signaling not just progress, but a purposeful effort to reclaim technological sovereignty and strategic autonomy. India's success in this area has not only reduced dependency, but has also positioned the country as a future leader in science, defense, and innovation. One of the clearest indicators of this transformation was India's achievement in space exploration. The Indian Space Research Organization ISRO, once viewed as a low-budget satellite agency, shocked the world with its successful Chandrayaan-3 mission landing on the Moon's south pole, something even the most technologically advanced countries had failed to achieve. This wasn't just a scientific milestone, it was a statement of intent. India accomplished what others with significantly higher budgets couldn't, showing that technological excellence wasn't the exclusive domain of Western nations. ISRO's efficiency, innovation, and ambition showcased the emergence of a self-reliant India with the capability to lead future space endeavors, including interplanetary missions and satellite diplomacy with partner nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But the story extends far beyond space. India's defense sector began to undergo a quiet revolution. Traditionally one of the world's largest arms importers, India had for decades relied on foreign-made tanks, aircraft, submarines, and missiles, often at great cost and with long delays. However, a new approach emerged with a focus on indigenization and technology transfer. Programs like Make in India and Defense Acquisition Procedure. Reforms pushed for locally produced equipment. The light combat aircraft Tejas, the Arjun battle tank, and the INS Vikrant, the country's first domestically built aircraft carrier, demonstrated that India could build cutting-edge defense systems. On its own, even more significant was the focus on exporting these capabilities. India, which once depended on the West for basic arms, is now entering the global defense market as a supplier, exporting to dozens of countries. The defense industrial complex, including public sector giants like HAL and DRDO, as well as private firms, is being overhauled to prioritize innovation, competitiveness, and scale. This rise as a defense producer reshapes India's position in the global security architecture. It is no longer just a strategic partner. It is becoming a strategic provider. Simultaneously, India's emergence as a technology hub rivaling Silicon Valley has made it a central player in the global digital economy. Indian engineers have long powered Western tech companies, but a deeper transformation has occurred within India itself. Homegrown digital platforms like Aadhaar, UPI, CoWin, and DigiLocker have created a digital public infrastructure unmatched in scope and scale. These platforms have been built for scale, used by hundreds of millions of people, and deployed at low cost. UPI alone processes billions of transactions each month and has been offered to countries looking to replicate its model. India is no longer importing Western fintech solutions. It is exporting them. At the same time, India's sovereignty policies have challenged the dominance of Western big tech. By insisting on local data storage, taxing digital giants, and tightening scrutiny over content and competition practices, India has forced companies like Google, Meta, and Amazon to comply with Indian regulations. This represents a critical shift in power dynamics. For the first time, a major democracy is not yielding to Western tech monopolies. It is dictating the rules of engagement within its borders. India's semiconductor ambitions also illustrate this new approach. Recognizing the strategic importance of chip manufacturing, the Indian government launched multi-billion-dollar incentive schemes to attract global and domestic players to build fabrication units. Within India, semiconductor self-reliance is crucial for national security and economic stability. By investing in this capability, India aims to insulate itself from supply shocks and geopolitical tensions that have previously crippled global tech supply chains. Western countries themselves are now looking at India not just as a consumer market, but as a future chip-making partner. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and cybersecurity are also seeing massive investment. India's focus on training its youth in emerging technologies through programs like Digital India, PM Kaushal Vikas Yojana, and AI Centers of Excellence reflects a strategic bet on becoming a future knowledge superpower. With one of the youngest workforces in the world and a booming startup culture, India is positioning itself not as a workshop of the world, but as the innovation lab of the global South. Strategically, India has also become more assertive in cyber defense, intelligence, and military coordination. It has established specialized cyber commands, upgraded surveillance infrastructure, and strengthened its missile defense systems. In contested regions like the Indo-Pacific, India has grown its naval strength and enhanced joint exercises with friendly nations. But unlike Cold War alliances, these engagements are carefully balanced. India remains outside formal military blocs like NATO. Instead, it chooses strategic autonomy, engaging multilaterally without binding itself to any single power. Moreover, India's refusal to become a technology colony has had psychological implications as well. Once a nation eager to buy, copy, or import, India is now confident in its ability to invent, lead, and export. This change in mindset, from consumers to creators, is reshaping not just the economy, but the national identity. Universities, research labs, startups, and government institutions are no longer looking to the West for solutions. They are building answers suited for Indian realities and global relevance. India's technological and strategic advancement has thus become the backbone of its rise. By asserting independence in space, defense, cybersecurity, and digital infrastructure, India has disrupted the traditional centers of power that long dictated global narratives. The day India took back power wasn't marked by confrontation. It was marked by quiet but decisive capability. It proved that power in the 21st century isn't just about weapons or alliances, it's about who controls the future. And in that race, India has chosen to lead. India's resurgence on the global stage has not only been economic and strategic, but deeply civilizational. For centuries, India's identity was distorted, diminished, and often dismissed by colonial powers and Western narratives that sought to present the East as inferior. While the economic and military dimensions of India's rise are visible and quantifiable, the most profound shift has been cultural, an internal awakening that is reshaping how India sees itself and how the world sees India. This cultural and civilizational reawakening has become a powerful source of influence, one that is challenging the West's centuries-old monopoly over soft power, values, and global discourse. At the heart of this transformation is the revival of India's ancient heritage, not as a relic of the past, but as a living force shaping the present and future. For decades, Indian culture, language, traditions, and knowledge systems were either sidelined or diluted in favor of Western ideals. English language education systems, colonial histories, and imported models of governance and economy attempted to sever India from its roots. But that model is now being reversed. India is reclaiming its civilizational confidence, drawing strength from its 5,000-year-old heritage to present a distinct world view, one rooted in harmony, sustainability, spiritual depth, and human dignity. One of the most visible manifestations of this resurgence has been the global rise of yoga and Ayurveda, once dismissed as superstition or pseudoscience by Western institutions. These ancient Indian systems are now widely respected and adopted across the world. International Yoga Day, celebrated on June 21st each year and endorsed by the United Nations, is a testament to India's growing soft power. Millions around the world practice yoga not as a trend but as a way of life, offering India a non-coercive, universal cultural influence that no Western entertainment brand can match. Similarly, Ayurveda is increasingly being integrated into modern healthcare systems, As people seek alternatives to over-commercialized Western medicine, India is exporting not only products but philosophies. The resurgence of Sanskrit and traditional Indian languages is another critical dimension. Once relegated to religious rituals and academia, Sanskrit is now being revived in classrooms, media, and technology. New institutions are emerging to teach and research Vedic knowledge, classical literature, and Indic sciences. Regional languages, too, are experiencing a renaissance in literature, cinema, and education, challenging the dominance of English and asserting linguistic pride. India is showing that intellectual advancement does not require abandoning native tongues. It can flourish through them. The Indian film industry has also emerged as a global cultural force, independent of Western validation. While Bollywood has long had a diaspora following, films rooted in Indian values and history, like RRR, Bahubali, and the Kashmir Files, have shattered records and entered global consciousness without compromising on Indian cultural identity. These films don't mimic Hollywood. They present uniquely Indian stories with unapologetic pride. This represents a broader shift. India is no longer trying to imitate the West. It is proudly being itself, and the world is watching. India's festivals, spiritual traditions, and rituals are also being revived and celebrated with renewed intensity. Events like Diwali, Holi, and Navratri are now observed not just in India, but across global cities, turning them into vehicles of cultural diplomacy. This celebration of tradition, once seen as outdated or rural, is now modern, vibrant, and proudly public. The construction of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, for instance, was not just a religious event. It was a symbolic reclamation of civilizational continuity. It declared that India's past was not something to be erased or hidden, but embraced as a foundation for its future. This cultural reawakening has also reshaped India's educational focus. New curricula are being introduced that incorporate Indian history from an Indian perspective, not the colonial lens that portrayed India as passive, backward, or conquered. Ancient Indian contributions in mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, medicine, and governance are being studied and taught with pride. India is producing a generation that is not ashamed of its past, but inspired by it. This intellectual decolonization is critical to nation building as it reorients self-perception away from dependence and towards self-confidence. At a diplomatic level, India is using this civilizational strength to form deeper bonds with other cultures and civilizations. It connects with nations in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East through shared historical, spiritual, and cultural links, not just transactional diplomacy. Indian epics, philosophies, and artistic expressions find resonance in many countries that once had strong cultural ties with ancient India. This soft power strategy stands in contrast to the often extractive and confrontational approach of the West. India influences not through imposition, but through inspiration. Furthermore, India is beginning to challenge Western narratives in global forums. When Western media and institutions attempt to critique India through a colonial lens, often with ignorance or prejudice, India no longer remains silent. It answers with facts, context, and a firm assertion of its values. Indian intellectuals, scholars, and diplomats are increasingly refusing to accept Western superiority in moral, political, or cultural terms. This marks a psychological shift where India is no longer seeking validation, but offering an alternative world view rooted in Dharma, righteousness, Sarvodaya, welfare of all, and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family. This civilizational awakening has even influenced how India handles global crises. During the COVID-19 pandemic, India sent vaccines, medicines, and humanitarian aid to dozens of countries, not for profit, but in the spirit of service. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was the application of civilizational ethics in real-world situations. As the West hoarded resources and prioritized profit, India shared what it had, earning goodwill and moral leadership. In reclaiming its civilizational roots, India is not turning inward, it is turning upward. It is proving that modernity and tradition are not opposites. It is showing that spiritual heritage can coexist with scientific progress, and it is demonstrating that a nation can rise not by copying others, but by being true to its essence. The day India took back cultural power from the West was the day it stopped apologizing for its identity and started celebrating it. That day continues to echo, not just in temples and festivals, but in minds, schools, and world capitals. It is a silent, steady revolution, and it is unstoppable.